Hello everybody and welcome to Azan Explains IB, and in today's video we are going over understanding statement 2 in unit 1.1 and understanding statement 2 in unit 1.1. This is all about the functions of life and how single-celled organisms such as Paramecium and any other single-cell organism carries out all the functions of life within one cell. So, in MYP, if you studied biology in MYP, you may have studied the characteristics of life. Those are still going to be very important. I know you might remember our favorite grandmom, Mrs. Edgren, being the acronym used to remember the characteristics of life. Well, your favorite granddad is also going to be introduced to you today, and this is Mr. Edgren, who represents the functions of life. Why such characteristic acronyms are so important is because it helps us to remember that we can actually differentiate between the differences and the similarities between both the functions and the characteristics. So the functions and the characteristics are actually very similar to one another. So in Mr. Edgren, the only difference that we have here is that M doesn't stand for movement, stands for metabolism, whereas in Mrs. Edgren, M stands for movement. R stands for response, whereas in characteristics of life, R stands for respiration, and Mrs. Edgren also includes the term sensitivity. And of course, the similarities therefore must be that H is homeostasis, G is growth, R is reproduction, E is excretion, and N is nutrition. So, all pretty straightforward stuff so far. Now, I think an explanation is in order. Simply understand what each part is. And I think what you'll find very pleasing about this topic is everything's very closely linked to one another. So, metabolism, which is what you will study in Unit 2 and Unit 8 in further detail, is simply the sum of all biochemical reactions, anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism means you go from small to bigger, and catabolism means you go from larger to smaller. So protein synthesis is when we take small proteins, we put them together, we get large, small amino acids come together, they make proteins, those proteins come together to make cells, so on and so forth. And respiration is literally taking a glucose molecule, which is this very complex C6H12O6 molecule, and breaking it down into simple molecules like CO2 and water. A good way to remember this is that catabolism has the word cat, and if you ever own a cat, you'll know that they break stuff all the time. So yeah, catabolism means going from larger to smaller as they break down larger molecules into simpler ones. Response is very similar to sensitivity, as they both mean changes and reactions to the environment. So if, for example, certain types of bugs and certain creatures in water do not like the light. They don't like bright areas. So what they do is instead they move towards darker areas, and they will often avoid light. So that's their sense of response. So we're going to skip sensitivity here and just move to movement and respiration. Movement simply refers to the permanent relocation of an organism. If an organism is able to change its position, it counts as movement. And respiration is a process whereby we convert glucose into ATP either in the presence or in the absence of oxygen. Again, respiration, you'll probably study more of that in Unit 2 and Unit 8. So let's look at the similarities. So homeostasis is nothing but keeping a constant, stable internal environment. So stasis sort of referring to the internal environment within an organism, and homeo means everything has to stay the same. Nothing. If it changes too much, like for example in the fever, if the fever is way too high, the body may start to deteriorate, and this is often one of the biggest causes of death, is just an inability to maintain homeostasis. Actually, is the very definition of death. It's just being able to maintain that. Growth simply refers to any organism which can change their permanent size. Reproduction refers to creating offspring, which helps them to pass on their genetics to the next generation. Excretion refers to expelling waste and excess materials, even if the materials may be beneficial, like in humans, for example, the urine that we have in our pee, or rather the urine that we excrete, is a lot of it contains water. So even if that water may or may not have been good for us, it still leaves the system sometimes. And nutrition is simply an organism's ability to gain and absorb nutrients. Okay, this part simply refers to the functions themselves, and this is sort of the understanding statement. What we need to now be able to see is, okay, let's focus on paramecium because that's more important. So by looking at paramecium as an organism and then looking at a picture of paramecium, you should be able to annotate it saying, okay, this part of the cell, so this is where knowing the parts of the cell becomes very important, which you study more in Unit 1, and that is knowing the different parts of the cell helps you to know their functions. When you know the functions, you can attribute each of these functions to a different function of life. So, for example, Paramecium, a single-celled organism, has cytoplasm, which carries out all the chemical reactions of that cell, which means that this represents the metabolism of the cell. The cell membrane, which represents homeostasis, is responsible for letting CO2 out and letting oxygen in. Very important for allowing the cell to conduct the other functions of life, such as its photosynthesis, which is carried through chloroplast, which is also a part of its metabolism. Paramecium also have what are known as contractile vacuoles, which are essential for excretion of waste. And what you'll notice here is, and these are different between drawings, you'll see like this sort of groove in the images. These grooves refer to feeding grooves, and they are important for nutrition. And finally, cilia refers to movement, and therefore movement can be attributed to response because often organisms will use this movement to move to safer environments and better, more preferred environments. Then we are going to look at another organism, Desmus, which again, it's not necessary to have to know this particular organism, but you will need to be able to identify another single-celled organism. So they also have a cell membrane responsible for their nutrition and homeostasis. They have a nucleus which is responsible for their reproduction and homeostasis. They have mitochondria, which is responsible for their metabolism. So is their cytoplasm and their flagella, which are kind of sticking out on the corners of the cell, are used in response to move between different areas depending on their preferred environment. Alright then, that concludes. So to summarize, we looked at the functions and characteristics of life, and we then talked about how these functions of life are carried out by cells, single-celled organisms such as Paramecium and Desmus, which need to be annotated, and you need to explain, or at least briefly outline, how each of the parts of the cell are attributed to a function of life. Thank you for listening to watching today's video, and hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.